Good morning, class. Very sorry for my confusion about YouTube. I am going to toggle over to Canvas and put out another little announcement with this video link. And I'm very sorry about this. This should be recorded for folks to view after the fact. And good, I think people are joining now. I'm very sorry for the confusion. I'm going to wait until I get about at least 15 folks online. Right now, there's 3. Right now, there's 6. That's good. I'm going to wait till I get about 15, and hopefully this will record so that folks can watch it later. Today, we're going to lecture on Plato. And we're looking at Plato's Euthephro today. By the way, I'm sorry for that video that I tried to record in Mexico. The internet service was really, really bad in Mexico, so I'm sorry that did not work out. I tell you what, the live chat should be working. Gosh. It should be working. I tell you what, if for those of you who are on right now, for some reason, I think that maybe the live chat is not working. Maybe if you could send me a text, that would be awesome. If you could send me a text at 903-944-8494, just to let me know that you are with me online. I'm really sad that the live chat does not seem to be working. I think I got it to work. Yep, I think I got it to work. That's great. All right, 6 of y'all are online. I'm hoping to hear some stuff on the live chat. Let me say real quick while I'm waiting, let me tell you why we're not having class personally today. Hello, Jocelyn and Sanchella. Thank you so much. Y'all, I went to Mexico to do a wedding this last week, and I have no reason to suspect that I have coronavirus. In fact, I had it earlier in the summer and then tested negative. So I'm pretty sure that I have an immunity to COVID. Nevertheless, just to be safe, I wanted to delay going into class on the campus this morning, just to be safe. I did test. I got a test yesterday, and I would love for those results to come back negative. Okay, y'all, I think I'm going to just go forward with today's lecture. There's 8 people online with me right now. I want to try to look at the class that I tried to record in Mexico because the show notes had a little outline. I cannot find it. The show notes had a little outline, which might be helpful to review, but I cannot find that. Oh, well. 9 folks are online at the moment. Y'all, thank you for joining me this morning. What we're doing today is we're going to talk about Plato's Euthephro. I did have a lecture that I gave in Mexico, just sort of introducing Plato. That was based on that Copleston article, which is PDF'd and on Canvas. I do encourage you to read that article. In fact, you will have one question on a quiz directly from that Copleston article. And you will have a quiz next week on Plato. So I think what I want to do right now is just get started with the Euthephro. The Euthephro is the first of these 5 dialogues that is in this book edited by Grube. And a couple things about the Euthephro. First off, it's a great dialogue of Plato's for folks who are beginners. It's a relatively short dialogue. It's not super complicated. It introduces several of Plato's basic themes. And so it's a great essay to begin with. The other thing that's interesting about this book is that all 5 of these dialogues, not all of which we are reading for our class, but all 5 of these dialogues are sort of stitched together into a larger plot. In fact, this last dialogue called the Phaedo, which we are not going to read, narrates the death of Socrates. Now, I wonder if anyone on live chat could tell me why it is that Socrates died. Can someone tell me how Socrates died and what led to his death? I mean, did he fall off of his horse and die? Did he commit suicide? Did he die of old age? I wonder if anyone on the live chat can hazard a guess as to how Socrates died and what led to his death. Can someone help me out here? Suicide and poison. Madison, thank you for that. Andrea, yes, he was executed. Why was he executed? To say that Socrates was executed sort of implies that he was found guilty of a crime, does it not? In fact, Socrates was found guilty of a crime, and the courtroom case, so to speak, is contained in this third dialogue, actually the second dialogue, the Apology. And that is one that we are going to read together. That's actually the only other dialogue that we're going to read this semester, the Apology. The only one in addition to the Euthephro that we're going to read is the Apology. And the Apology is actually his court case. The Crito talks about his time in prison, and then the Phaedo narrates his death. So Andrea, you are exactly right. Socrates was executed. And the reason he was executed is that he was found guilty of a crime. And what was that crime? Well, we're going to come back to that in a moment, because the Euthephro is the dialogue that sort of takes a first pass at what Socrates was found guilty of. The Apology goes into more depth on that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to point out that the Euthephro is a great beginner's dialogue for folks that are new to Plato. But then secondly, that all 5 of these dialogues are stitched together so as to form a larger overall plot that really narrates the life of Socrates. But it all begins with this first dialogue that we're looking at today, namely the Euthephro. And so what I want to do now is I want to spend about the next 45 minutes, and y'all, I think I'm going to try to have you out of here. I'm going to try to end class at, I'm going to say 9:15 or 9:20 today. It would be super awesome if Kyrie could give me a heads up at about 9:10 so that I can know when to begin to land the plane. But we're going to talk about the Euthephro today. And what I want to do before I do anything else, what I want to do is sort of introduce the Euthephro by talking about 3 big themes. And all 3 of these themes are found on page 1 in the little introduction to the dialogue that Grube, the editor of this volume, that Grube gives you. So 3 themes that are addressed in the Euthephro. Number 1 Socrates' presentation of the forms. Y'all, the forms is something that we're going to come back to over and over again throughout the course of this class. When we get to Aristotle, we're going to be talking a whole lot about the relationship, the dialectical relationship, actually, between form and matter. So Aristotle has his own notions about form, and he talks about that. We'll get there in a couple of weeks. But Plato also has his own notion of the forms. And those begin to be introduced in this dialogue, the Euthephro. And I will just say that the connection in the Euthephro in which we see the forms has to do with this notion of the pious, what we call the pious. You could also say piety, but I'm just going to say the pious. Whenever I say the pious, what that means is that which is pious. Side note, one of the things that I try to do in my intro to philosophy class is to help students think and help students learn to read. And that requires paying close attention to language, not just the meaning of terms, but also the way grammar works. Now, let me ask you guys another question for those of you who are with me on chat. The word pious, P-I-O-U-S. By the way, sometimes in other English translations, it's translated as holy. Whether you take the word pious or the word holy, what part of speech is that word? What part of speech is the word pious? Can someone answer that question for me on the live chat? In order to answer that question, you have to know what I mean by parts of speech, right? We're sort of talking about grammar at this moment. But the question that I want to ask you guys is, what part of speech is the word pious? I'm going to respond to this text. Good. You guys are awesome. Yes, it is an adjective. The word pious is an adjective. However, did you know that did you know that adjectives can be turned into nouns? So maybe you've heard the phrase, the good, the true, and the beautiful, or the big, bad, and the ugly. Have you ever heard that phrase, the big, bad, and the ugly? All three of those terms, big, bad, and ugly, are adjectives. However, they can all be turned into nouns, right? The big, the bad, and the ugly, or the good, the true, and the beautiful. All three of those terms are also adjectives. And so you see, adjectives can be turned into nouns. And whenever we take an adjective and turn it into a noun, that is called the substantival use of the adjective, or just a substantival adjective. A substantival adjective, I'm going to write that in the notes, a substantival adjective is an adjective that has been turned into a noun, okay? A substantival adjective is an adjective that's been turned into a noun. And that's what's going on here in the Euthephro, because this dialogue is about something called the pious. That word pious is an adjective, but when we say the pious, it turns it into a noun, just like the good, the true, and the beautiful, or the big, the bad, and the ugly. The pious. Another way to think about it would be that which is pious, okay? So what is at issue in this dialogue, the Euthephro, is the pious. Socrates is trying to get at the essence of what piety is, aka what the pious is, okay? Y'all, I know this is a little bit weird, but this is what it's like to do ancient philosophy. You got to keep in mind that Plato and Socrates lived 2,300 years ago. They lived in a world that was crazy different from our world. And so it shouldn't surprise us that we have to talk about some things that are a little bit weird. These people didn't have Twitter. They didn't have Instagram. They lived 2,300 years ago, and it was a completely different culture. By the way, for any of you who are Christians or Muslims or Jews in the class, the same exact thing applies to those holy texts. The world of the Bible was a crazy different world than ours is. And so what we have to do is we have to learn how to enter into their world. And part of what it means to enter into the world of those ancient thinkers and writers is conforming ourselves to the way that they thought and using funky ass terms like the pious, okay? And remember, that can also be translated as the holy. But whether it's pious or holy, those are both adjectives that are turned into nouns, aka they are what? What do we call an adjective that has been turned into a noun? Can someone tell me in the live chat? What is an adjective that's been turned into a noun? By the way, it's really great to see all of you guys. That's right, Mackenzie, good job. It's a substantival adjective. Okay, so pressing on with my little three big themes. Good job, Jocelyn. Pressing on with my three little themes, all of which are outlined by Grube in his introductory notes to the Euthephro. Number one, Socrates' presentation of the forms. This discussion of the forms comes into play because essentially Socrates is looking for the form, or for now we could say the essence of the pious, okay? Secondly, the claim that the gods love what is pious because it is pious. We're going to get to that in a moment, but what we're going to see is that things are not pious, or you could say holy, because the gods decree that they are holy. No, no, no. That is not the case for Socrates or Plato, and we will see why that is the case. We'll see why that's true here in a minute. But then thirdly, Grube makes the point that in this dialogue, we begin to encounter Plato's thought about genus and species. And by the way, that's closely related to form. In fact, the Greek word for form is the same word for genus and species. And y'all, whenever we talk about genus and species, what I have in mind, and I've already shown you this once in the class, I have in mind the taxonomic hierarchy of biology that was created by Charles Linnaeus. Charles Linnaeus. It's called binomial nomenclature. It's you know, you've heard of like you've heard of domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The dude that invented all of that is a man named Charles Linnaeus. I would encourage you to go to his YouTube, his Wikipedia page, and just scan that. But whenever we talk about genus and species, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So for example, let me think. My stock example of genus and species, which I need to memorize this so I don't have to look it up every time. My stock example, give me one sec, is I found it the other day for you guys. Give me one sec here. I'm looking at my blog. Give me one sec. My stock example of genus and species is hang with me. You guys are awesome. Basically, I blogged my way through my PhD dissertation, which was actually a really good way to do it. Give me 1 sec. I'm almost there. Ugh. Gosh. I think my internet connection is down. Okay, I found it. My stock example of genus and species is the Amaryllis belladonna, which you could find on Wikipedia. But see, that's an example of genus and species, the Amaryllis belladonna. That's a scientific classification. And that system of scientific classification, by the way, I'll put a link to that, to what I'm talking about, in the show notes below, or at least I'll try to do that. But that scientific classification was invented by a dude named Charles Linnaeus, 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 Charles Linnaeus. He invented this system of genus and species. And so what Grube is wanting to say is that these are three big themes that are introduced by the Euthephro. Number one, Socrates' presentation of the forms. Number two, this idea that things are holy/pious, not because God says that they are, but actually God says that they are because they're holy/pious. We're going to get to that in a moment. Then thirdly, Grube's point is that in this dialogue, we begin to see Plato's thinking about genus and species. Okay? All right, y'all, what I want to do now is to delve into the text of the Euthephro. I'm grateful to Kyrie for giving me a warning at about 9:10. Andrea, I certainly hope that this video will be uploaded so that you can go back and watch it later, and also so those who haven't been able to join us today can watch it. I will, assuming, I'm sure that it's possible to make that happen. And actually, whenever I started this YouTube video, I did make it public so that anyone in the universe can find it. So I think that the answer to that question is yes. I'm certainly intending for you to be able to watch this later. And if that turns out not to be the case, it's only because I couldn't make it happen technologically. And even then, no one will be penalized at all. I'm not going to let you be penalized because of technological difficulties or my own incompetence, okay? But y'all, what I want to do now is to begin to actually talk about the Euthephro. I want to get this over with today. I don't want to keep talking about the Euthephro next class, because next class, I want to begin to talk about Plato's Apology. But let's delve into the Euthephro. So, what's interesting is the legal context, or you might even say the legal setting of this dialogue. Now, you got to remember that Plato's texts, the texts that Plato writes, are not systematic treatises like a geometry textbook or like Aristotle's writings. This right here is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is a book that we read whenever I teach Introduction to Ethics at UT Tyler. And if you were to read this book, here's book 8 of Aristotle's Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, you would see that it's very, very systematic. Aristotle is very much a scientific thinker. He wants to be systematic. He wants to present a system to his readers, and he wants readers to be able to see the connections within the system and also to be able to grasp the system as a whole. He's very systematic and scientific in that way, but guess what? Plato is not. Plato doesn't write systematically. He's not interested in that kind of systematic analysis. Plato's more of an artist. Plato is more of a storyteller. And that is true in all 5 of these dialogues. And in fact, every dialogue that Plato wrote. but it is emphatically true of the Euthephro. The Euthephro is a story, which means that it has a setting, and that setting is a legal one, a legal setting. Who can tell me? Let me ask you this, y'all. I have two questions for you to get this discussion going. Question number one, who is Socrates' primary dialogue partner in this story? Who is Socrates' primary dialogue partner in this story? That's my first question. My second question is, where do they initially meet? Where do Socrates and his dialogue partner initially meet? Who can answer those two questions for me? I'm going to wait for you on live chat. Even if you say, I don't know, that's better than crickets, okay? Good, Kyrie, outside the courthouse. That's exactly right. Now, is the technical term courthouse? Let's just go with courthouse. There's another word that pops up in the beginning of the story, and it's the word deme, D-E-M-E. And good job, Emily. Euthephro is the main dialogue partner outside the courthouse. Y'all, that is really awesome. There's this word deme, D-E-M-E, that pops up. Basically what happens is Miletus and Socrates meet up, let's just say outside the courthouse, and they're like, what are you doing here? I don't know. What are you doing here? And so first, Miletus begins to ask Socrates if he has gotten into legal trouble. And Socrates' answer is yes. Someone is bringing charges against me. Oh, by the way, yeah, I may have misspoke. I may have said that Miletus is Socrates' main dialogue partner. That is incorrect. Socrates' main dialogue partner is Euthephro. So most of y'all already know that. Good job. Socrates and Euthephro meet outside of the courthouse, and they begin to talk about Socrates' legal problems, okay? And Socrates looks at Euthephro and he's like, yeah, there's this guy named Miletus who's bringing charges against me. And Miletus is from the deme of Pythus. Now, I probably won't test you over this, but I want you to notice that word deme because it's connected to the word democracy. One of the things that I wanted to talk to y'all about and failed to record in Mexico, based on the Copleston essay, is the fact that Plato and Aristotle were not big fans of democracy. The reason they weren't big fans of democracy, and this is something I'm just going to throw out here right now, and this is something that I want you to write down and remember. We will come back to it over and over in this class. But Plato and Aristotle were not big fans of democracy, and here's why. They say and they think that an unvirtuous people cannot govern themselves well, and that there's never been such a thing as a virtuous populace, okay? An unvirtuous populace cannot govern themselves well, cannot govern itself well, and never in the history of the human race has there been a virtuous people. The idea is that for democracy to work, the people have to be virtuous. We will come back to this over and over again, but for now, what I want to say is that word deme is connected to the word democracy. Basically, in 5th century Athens, in ancient Athens, it was a democracy, although don't get too excited about that because women couldn't vote, sorry, and slaves couldn't vote, sorry. Now, the slavery back then was really different from what you and I normally think of. It wasn't race-based slavery, so we don't have to talk. We don't have time to talk about that now. But what I just want to say is that yes, ancient Athens was a democracy, but no, it's not the case that every single human being created in God's image. And by the way, I'm speaking as a Christian right there. It's not the case that every single human being created in God's image was allowed to vote. Rather, only male free citizens were allowed to vote. But it was a democracy, and that's connected to that word deme, which basically means people. It was sort of like a political unit, a political designation. Deme, it's kind of like a region or a political precinct, but it's connected to the idea of people. And the word democracy means rule of the people. That word krasi means rule. So I'm going to put it like this in the chat. Dema means people. Krasi means rule. And we can talk more about that over the course of the class. But the first thing that comes up in this dialogue is that they start talking about Plato's legal problems. And what Plato says is that there's this dude named Meletus who is bringing charges against me. Now, I want to just spit out real quick what those charges are. Can anyone tell me what are the two charges that are brought against Socrates? What are the two charges that Meletus is bringing against Socrates? The first one is talked about at 3b. That's right, corrupting the youth, Andrea, is one of them. We're going to talk about that over and over in this class, especially when we get to the apology. You are correct. Corrupting the youth is one of the two charges brought against Socrates. What is the other one? He's making new gods. That's right. Kyrie is correct. He is making new gods without believing in the old ones. Adan, I like your answer, impiety, and same for Sancella. But it's important to sort of tether yourself to the actual text. In other words, the first step in answering a question like this is to take the text literally. And what the text literally says is that there are two charges being brought against Socrates. Number one, quote, creating new gods and not believing in the old gods, close quote. By the way, that's at marginal number 3b. I'm not going to talk about page numbers because in ancient texts like Plato's Dialogues, it's a much better practice instead to talk about the marginal numbers. Sometimes they are called Stephanus numbers. You can see that there's little marginal numbers here in the margins. Those are the numbers that we're going to go by. And if you can find marginal number 3b, that is where it says that Socrates is being accused of, quote, creating new gods and not believing in the old gods, close quote. And Andrea is correct that he's also accused of corrupting the youth. And by the way, those are connected. I want to pause really quick right here and just point out that already we're seeing that in this dialogue, the gods are an issue. What is God? Who is God? How should we think about God? That's already an issue in this dialogue. And that is one of the reasons, y'all, why I opened up the class with this discussion about Parmenides, because Parmenides says that if there's anything that's real, it has to be simple. Simple. What I mean by simple is not spatially extended, not consisting of parts and wholes, not subject to any kind of change, etc. All of that stuff that Parmenides says characterizes being, no change, also no diversity or multiplicity. All of that stuff that Parmenides says must be the case with respect to being, all of that stuff, what Plato and Aristotle think, is actually applicable to God. See, what I was trying to say to you is about Parmenides is that really he's talking about God. And so you can see that already in this dialogue, the Euthephro, Plato is also talking about God. What is piety? Also, Socrates is getting accused of denying the gods or having some sort of problematic viewpoint with respect to the gods. The only point that I'm trying to make to you right now is that the gods and God is extremely central already to what's going on in the Euthyphro. And the real thing that I'm trying to say to you guys is that you cannot, if you're going to understand philosophy from a historical point of view, which is the point of view that I'm interested in giving you in this class, if you want to understand philosophy from a historical point of view, you cannot separate it from theology. The issue of God is involved in philosophy from the very, very beginning. And you can see that already in the Euthyphro. Socrates, 2 charges, and y'all, this will probably find its way on a quiz or a final exam. Number 1, corrupting the youth. Number 2, denying the gods of the city / inventing false gods. Okay. So that is the little discussion about Socrates' case. Okay. So Socrates and Euthyphro, they meet up outside the courthouse. They begin to have a discussion. And the first thing that they talk about is Socrates' legal problems, right? Then they shift and talk about Euthephro's legal problems. And it's really in the context of Euthephro's legal problems that the rest of the dialogue begins to unfold. You know why? It's because the more Euthephro talks, the more Socrates begins to pick apart what he says. See, Socrates doesn't claim to know anything. If you read these dialogues, what you begin to realize is that it's not the case that Socrates is giving some lecture like I'm doing right now. No, what Socrates is doing is he's asking questions to his dialogue partner. By the way, another word for dialogue partner is interlocutor. What you begin to notice in these dialogues is that it's not the case that Socrates is just giving a lecture like I'm doing right now. No, what he does instead is he walks up to people and begins to ask them questions. He asks them questions, he listens to their answer, and then he begins to cross-examine them and to pick apart their statements. And that's exactly what we see in the Euthyphro, because it's not until Euthyphro begins to open up his mouth and talk about his legal issues that Socrates begins to ask questions. And it's that dialogue of Socrates asking questions to Euthyphro that opens up the real meat and substance of this dialogue. Okay, so let's talk about the basic facts of Euthyphro's legal problems. Basically, can someone tell me what Euthyphro? What is Euthyphro's situation? Is he being charged of a crime, or is he bringing charges against someone else? Who can answer that for me? You could put it like this: is Euthephro the defendant or the prosecutor? That's right, Elizabeth. He's prosecuting his father for murder. And it's kind of an interesting situation. We don't really have time to get into it very much. I'm really proud of you guys for doing the reading, though. That's super awesome. He is bringing charges against his father, which obviously is super controversial. It's even more controversial because his father, in turn, was sort of punishing a hired helper who killed a slave. And his father, even, you could argue that his father didn't even intend to kill the hired helper. He sort of chained him to a pole, and the hired helper basically died of starvation. So the point is, this is an extremely controversial thing that Euthyphro is doing. Not only does it raise eyebrows if someone prosecutes his father, because that's seen as very impious, very impious. But even if you look at the details of what his father did, it's not clear that what Euthephro is doing is faithful. All right. So that's right. Euthephro is bringing charges against his father. And so this leads to a question, and this is the big question of the dialogue. I'm going to talk about this for about 20 or 25 more minutes. The big question of the dialogue that Euthephro's case leads into is, what is piety? And I'm going to put this in the chat. The big question of the dialogue: what is piety, aka the pious? That's the big question of the dialogue. And y'all, there's really 3 different answers. And even before we get into the 3 answers, let me ask you a question. Who is it that proposes the answers? Who is it that proposes the answers to the question, what is pious? Yeah, Euthephro. Y'all, that is super interesting. It's not the case that Socrates says, Euthephro, let me give you 3 possible answers to the question, what is piety? No, it's always Euthephro. And then Socrates is just hanging back, chilling, and waiting to cross-examine Euthephro's answers. That's the way that all of these Platonic dialogues work, and that is super important. And y'all, this is an example of Socratic irony. And I'm going to write something else in the show notes, in the chat real quick. Socratic irony is Socrates saying, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything at all. See, Socrates in all these dialogues, he feigns ignorance. Now, is he really ignorant? Well, that's an interesting question. Here's another interesting question. Does he actually take himself to be ignorant? My suspicion is that he really does. He really does think that he doesn't know jack squat. But obviously, it turns out that he's the wisest person in the room every single time. We're going to talk more about that in the Apology. A lot of what the Euthephro is doing is just setting us up for big issues that we're going to cover in the Apology. But I want you to realize that it's not Socrates who puts forth the answers, it's Euthephro, which is crazy. Socrates hangs back and he picks apart the things that Euthephro says. But what is Euthephro's first answer to the question, what is piety? His first answer is that which is loved by the gods, okay? Now, before we do anything else, I want to draw your attention to, and I want to ask you a question. What is Socrates' first response to Euthephro's answer? So the question is, what is piety? Euthephro's first answer, his first blush answer, is that which is loved by the gods, right? And so my question to you is, what is Socrates' initial response to Euthephro's statement? This is riveting. This is riveting. Someone tell me, what is Socrates' initial response to Euthephro's answer? Oh, the pious is that which is loved by the gods. What is Socrates' first answer? By the way, Euthephro's answer, Emily, that's great, but you're jumping the gun a little bit. I want us to slow down and be very, very attentive to literally the first thing that comes out of Socrates' mouth. Emily, you are not wrong. But there's something even more basic, even simpler. Yes, Andrea, you are correct. Aren't the gods at odds with each other? That's right. That is the first thing that comes out of Socrates' mouth. I mean, Euthephro basically says, let me tell you what's pious, Socrates, that which is loved by the gods. But the first initial objection that Socrates has with Euthephro's answer is, that can't be, because anyone who's ever read anything that Homer wrote, like the Odyssey or the Iliad, knows that the gods are almost never in agreement. The gods are constantly arguing amongst themselves. The gods are constantly disagreeing about what's good. If you look at Homer's Iliad, half of the gods are pulling for Odysseus and company, and the Greeks and Achilles. The other half of the gods are pulling for the Trojans and Hector. So you see, the gods do not agree. And y'all, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this vindicates Parmenides. Remember what Parmenides says. He says, if anything exists at all, it must be one. In other words, what Parmenides says is that if being / God exists, it cannot be diverse. It cannot be it cannot be a matter of multiplicity. It cannot be more than one. We talked about this, right? If the blue pen and the highlighter, if you have a blue pen and a highlighter, for Parmenides, that's problematic, because remember, that involves the notion of non-being. How? Because the blue pen is not the highlighter, and the highlighter is not the blue pen. Parmenides says, whack a non-being. Whack a non-being. That can't be the case. Being must be one. It must be unified. It must not be a matter of multiplicity or diversity. There can't be two parts to that which is real. And I think that Socrates' initial answer to Parmenides, his initial answer to Euthephro, already shows this. What Socrates is saying is, hey, Euthephro, your notion, your thinking is all messed up, because in your opinion, the gods are multiple. The gods are several. And you see, the fact that they disagree is a function of the fact that they're multiple. If there were only one God, then there could be no disagreement in the divine. Does that make sense? So yeah, I just think that's interesting. I think that Socrates' very, very first response to Euthephro, he's echoing and he's channeling the spirit of Parmenides, okay? Now, whenever they get into this discussion about what is piety, Euthephro first wants to say, oh, here's what's pious, whatever the gods say is pious. In other words, what Euthephro is trying to say is that the gods approve of something, and that's what makes it pious. The gods approve of something, and that's what makes it holy. So let's just take marriage. Let's just take marriage, for example. Let's assume that God likes marriage, okay? What Euthephro is saying is, the reason marriage is holy or pious is because God says that it's holy or pious. Now, Socrates does not like this idea, and this gets back to what Emily said. Socrates does not like this idea because, from his perspective, if marriage is holy only because God says it's holy, that makes it arbitrary. What that means is that marriage is not holy in and of itself. Marriage is holy just because God says that it's holy. And by the way, what if God were to change his mind next year? Or what if God were to say that something else is holy? Or what if God were suddenly to say that marriage is not holy? bottom line, and this can get super, super complicated, this little facet of their discussion. I'm trying to keep it super simple. Socrates wants to say that it cannot be the case that marriage is holy just because God says it's holy, because that is arbitrary. What Socrates wants to say, and actually, what's interesting is that Socrates never comes up with his own account of what the pious is. He only shoots down Euthephro's answer. So yeah, Socrates wants to say that that cannot work. It cannot be the case that marriage is holy just because God says it's holy. There has to be a better way. And y'all, if we had more time, I would want to tell you how important this is for the development of theology in the West, because Christians have taken this little position of Socrates and expanded it. The bottom line is that from a Christian point of view, marriage is holy, not because God says it is, but rather God says that it's holy because it is holy. And then the question becomes, well, why is it holy? And the answer is because it participates in God's being. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on that more. I just want to say that the Christian perspective and the traditional perspective, for example, the perspective of C.S. Lewis, Thomas Aquinas, and St. Augustine, it builds upon the move that Socrates makes, that Plato makes, here in this context of the Euthephro. And we could talk more about that. By the way, that would be a great paper topic. The issue here is that Socrates' rejection of Euthephro's argument is a plank upon which Christian and Jewish and Muslim tradition builds over time. That would be a great paper topic. I would love to discuss that more with you. But for now, I want to move on to Euthephro's second answer for what constitutes piety. But before I do that, we need to take a little interlude and talk about Daedalus. Y'all, I want to draw your attention to this part about Daedalus. Daedalus is a mythological figure, and Socrates talks about him. I wonder if someone could tell me. Oh yeah, it's on the page in this volume. It's on page 14, but it's at marginal number 11C, marginal number 11C. And I want to draw your attention to Socrates' use of Daedalus because it has to do with science. It has to do with scientia. It has to do with knowledge. The Greek word for knowledge or science is the word episteme. Episteme. Y'all remember what the weird little markings over the E is? That means that it's a long E as opposed to a short E. Episteme. I'm probably not going to require you to remember that term, but for now, just know that it means knowledge or science. The Latin word for science is scientia. Scientia. And we begin to see a discussion of this issue in Socrates' discussion about Daedalus, because basically what Socrates says is that if you think about the mythological figure of Daedalus, Daedalus was a sculptor. And the thing about Daedalus's sculptures is that they would move around. Daedalus was a demigod, which means that he had these supernatural type powers, kind of like a superhero, but he was a god. And whenever he sculpted figures, the figures would move around. I always think about the very first Harry Potter movie. there's a scene in the very first Harry Potter movie, I think, whenever there's this huge checkerboard and Harry and Hermione and Ron are in this conflict, and they find themselves in the middle of this huge chessboard. I may have said checkers, I meant chess, this huge chessboard, and lo and behold, the chess pieces can move themselves. The pawns, the knights, the bishops, they can all move themselves. Well, that's how Daedalus's figures were. Daedalus's figures would move around. In other words, they were not tied down. They were not secured to the ground. When we lived in Austin, one time we had this beautiful set of patio furniture on the front porch. And one night someone came and stole our patio furniture. Well, guess what? Ever since that happened, we bought some chains and padlocks, and now we have secured our patio furniture to the ground so that someone can't come along and steal it. Y'all, the first initial pass that we have in this class to try to figure out what is knowledge, what is science, is this image from Daedalus that Socrates gives us. What he says is that knowledge is tied down. It's secured down to the ground. Knowledge can't be a matter of things moving around and shifting around randomly. And I just wanted to get to that before I get to Euthephro's second answer. And I now have 10 minutes, and I'm definitely going to finish in time. Euthephro's second answer has to do, Euthephro comes along and he says, oh, okay, Socrates, my first answer was wrong. Let me give you a second answer in my attempt to define piety. And what he says is, oh, here's what it is. Piety is caring for the gods. And then Socrates responds, and of course he's going to shoot this down and pick this apart. And the way he does that is and again, this is connected to Parmenides. You can see that Socrates is not a big fan of the Greek gods, y'all. And so that charge that was brought against him, that he is inventing new gods and that he is disregarding the gods of the city, which are the traditional pantheon of Greek gods like Zeus and company, those charges have a basis in reality, okay? You can tell that Socrates isn't a big fan of the Greek gods because his response to Euthephro's second answer, namely, oh, piety is caring for the gods, Socrates does not like this answer, and he responds by saying this. He basically says, okay, Euthephro, let's talk about what it means to care for something. And what he says is what it means to care for something usually means to improve it. So, for example, he uses the analogy of animal husbandry. And by the way, you'll see this over and over in Plato's dialogues. Socrates is always appealing to animal husbandry, usually someone who raises horses. It may be that several people in my class love to ride horses. We live in East Texas. A lot of people have horses. I myself am more of a city boy, so I've ridden horses a few times, but I've never been a big horse guy. Socrates loves to talk about raising horses and animal husbandry. And when you think about what it means to care for a horse, it means to improve the horse, to make the horse better. But then Socrates says, now, is that what you mean when you talk about caring for the gods, Euthephro? Do you mean improving the gods? Because basically what Socrates is saying is, hey, Euthephro, if your gods need to be improved, then they're not God. And by the way, I hope that you can see how that's also channeling the spirit of Parmenides, because what Parmenides wants to say is that being / the divine cannot change. And if we're going to improve something, can't you see how that involves changing the thing for the better? I mean, if I'm a gardener and I plant a rose bush, I'm wanting that rose bush to change. I'm wanting that rose bush to develop. I'm wanting that rose bush to mature and to become better, right? And the same thing is true for animal husbandry. Socrates is looking at Euthephro going, if your God needs to be improved, then your God is not God. That is exactly what Socrates is saying to Euthyphro, and that is Socrates' second response. It's Socrates' response to Euthephro's second attempt to define the pious, okay? And y'all, the third of Euthyphro's attempts to define piety is, he says, oh yeah, well, maybe the pious is knowledge of how to sacrifice and pray, okay? And Socrates responds to this by saying, hey, Euthyphro, you're assuming that the gods need something from you. You're talking about sacrificing to the gods. Okay, let's talk more about what you mean by that. Socrates says, Euthyphro, you're assuming that God needs something from you. And again, if God needs something from you, that's not God. Now, it might be Zeus, but Socrates is insinuating and hinting that actually, if God is God, God does not need anything from us. Because if God does need something from us, then what that does is it turns religion into this transaction. It's kind of like I scratch God's back, God scratches my back. It's this tit for tat relationship with God that turns God into a cosmic bellhop, as if God exists to do us favors and we exist to do God favors. And Socrates says that can't be right. If that's what God is, Socrates says, I want to be an atheist. And next class, I'm going to talk about how the earliest Christians were accused of being atheists. They were accused of being atheists and also cannibals, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to talk about that next class when we discuss Plato's Apology. For now, I just want to leave you with the thought that I hope that you can see how this dialogue, the Euthyphro, is thoroughly theological. This is not a theology class. This is a philosophy class. But if you're going to approach philosophy from a historical point of view, to begin with the pre-Socratics, move up through Plato and Aristotle, et cetera, onto the medieval age, into the modern age, if you're going to do it like that, then you cannot talk about philosophy in a way that is separated from theology. What I'm trying to say to you guys is that this dialogue is about theology. What Socrates is doing is he's critiquing the gods. He's critiquing the way that Euthyphro views the gods. If you look at Euthyphro's definitions of the pious, you can see that he has a notion of God that is incoherent. And I want to put it like this. I'm going to put it like this, and then I'm going to close the class. Euthyphro's manner of articulating piety flies in the face of the Parmenidean way of thinking about the gods / being. And I'm going to write that down in the note, in the chat, because that's what I'm trying to say about this dialogue. Euthyphro's attempts to define piety betray his non-Parmenidean way of thinking about being / the divine. Okay? Y'all, thanks for putting up with me. I'm sorry that we've had technological difficulties so far. I do not know if we're going to have class in person on Thursday. I'm kind of wanting to get my test results back. But I will give you more information on that tomorrow. And I will say that if we do it on my YouTube channel, I will make that clear and less confusing. Okay? May the force be with you and also with you. Peace out. Bye-bye.